I think majority of the burden of the tax system is being borne by people who are visible to the state rather than people who are outside of the net and conveniently remain to do so. What we're doing is we're building a system that is not easy to cheat and that is not easy to escape.
Being a salaried taxpayer, I feel like the entire burden is on my shoulders, running
Mhm.
this country.
But there was a research that specifically pointed out that of women's or like girls' absenteeism from school, like 5 to 10% of that was explained due to lack of access to these products, just because of the price, because of the tax that makes the price higher and makes it difficult for people to consume.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Legally Speaking. I'm your host, Oves Anver. The federal budget for the financial year 2026 to 27 has been passed. There have been quite a few headline-making developments, from the removal of the so-called pink tax to promising relief to the salaried class, which includes myself. The real question remains whether this budget can ignite growth that has been lagging for quite some time. And to help understand this, I am joined by Dr. Zehra Farooqui. Zehra is an economist and special assistant to member strategic transformation at the Federal Board of Revenue. Zehra, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much, Oves, for having me. It is a pleasure to be on the podcast with you.
Thank you. Zehra, I wanted to begin by, this much discussed, it's made headlines, this removal of the pink tax. Now, my understanding is that the pink tax is a wider connotation, but in Pakistan's context, we're talking about, in fact, why don't I let you answer that? What really was this that's being discussed, that the pink tax was removed through this budget? Could you explain that to us? And perhaps could you also, go into what the wider connotation of a pink tax is for people?
Absolutely. I think that's a wonderful question and something that I think just requires broader clarity because of the fact that the term itself, like paying tax, has been kind of, I don't want to use the term misused, but it has kind of been misused while talking about
Yeah.
the recent changes in the tax law regarding, the abolition of certain taxes on female hygiene products as well as contraceptives and specifically female hygiene products. And people have been calling it pink tax, which there is a material difference between the abolition of the tax that was levied on, female hygiene products, compared to what pink tax actually means. So, pink tax generally is a terminology that looks into this market price differential that exists between products, like similar products used by men and women. So, a good example from the international market would be like having one price for a razor that's blue and for men, whereas having a different and higher price for a razor that is pink compared to the blue for women. And generally, this differential just because a similar product is priced higher because it is pink, used to be referred to as pink tax around the world.
So sorry,
Now,
just help me to understand. So this was a marketing thing. This was private firms setting different prices for these. This wasn't the government imposing a particular. Okay, sorry.
yeah,
Please.
yeah. So it was a market phenomenon which was then referred to as pink tax.
Okay.
And there was a post I did on LinkedIn as well, where I, in principle, had a disagreement over the use of this term because I do think that because of the fact that it is a market phenomenon, not something relevant to taxes, it just brings around this negative connotation around the word tax. And I
Mhm.
feel like it kind of creates, because it creates this negative connotation around the word tax, it kind of discourages compliance because people already have, like, these issues with paying taxes, with being compliant. And
That's fair.
when you associate something like this, something which is essentially a negative narrative, with something that's not tax to begin with, it is a market phenomena, I think it further distorts how people behave towards taxes. So that's where my principal disagreement with the use of this word comes from. Now, within Pakistan's context, the abolition of taxes on female hygiene products were being referred to as the abolishment of pink tax, which that's not what it is essentially. What we've done within this budget, and I do want to admire the senior leadership in like taking a stand on this, essentially on every forum, was essentially making Pakistan one of the 17 countries to have abolished this tax entirely.
Wow.
We have also within this budget abolished taxes on contraceptives and related medicines. But I think the bigger thing here, the bigger thing that should be appreciated is the fact that what is associated, with this tax on female hygiene products. Now, we do not have a lot of research from within Pakistan it would have been ideal if this was something that was studied in terms of how it impacts women's labor force participation or their participation in education or their overall educational attainment. But there's a lot of research done internationally on the impact of such taxes. For example, from the US, there is a particular study, and I can share the link with you later if you want to share it for
Absolutely.
your viewers. But there was a research that specifically pointed out that of women's or like girls' absenteeism from school, like 5 to 10% of that was explained due to lack of access to these products, just because of the price, because of the tax that makes the price higher and makes it difficult for people to consume it. Because this is not a general consumption product. Essentially, if we tax female hygiene products or anything that is related to the biology of a person, we're not necessarily taxing consumption. We're taxing a biological feature,
Yeah.
which, in no sense of the word tax is fair. And so I do think that for this budget in particular, from a social welfare point, from a human capital investment point, and from an economic point overall, I think this was one of the big things in the budget, even though the quantum of it might be really small. So I do think that in the long run, it is a right step. Like the direction of travel in this case is absolutely fantastic when it comes to, more gender neutral policies.
Absolutely. And I mean, a country where, 26 million children are out of school, and, my stats are maybe old, but, um, and we clearly know, having done the research in this, that girls, when they reach puberty, they're dropping out of school because of, these very reasons that they don't have access to, hygiene products that are there.
Yeah.
And then increasing the cost to that just becomes, such a, I would say, a no-brainer. And I'm so glad that this step has been taken. Zahir, do you feel that this is part of perhaps a broader realization or understanding of how the budget impacts society, impacts women and things as interlinked as education and health and all of those factors?
Yes, I definitely think so, because I think just by having, these kinds of policy changes or like these kinds of measures being taken in the budget, I think reflects that, the sitting policymakers are aware that the extent of which a certain policy could impact, the lives of normal people around them. Because generally we view the budget as only increases in prices. Like we look at increase in petrol prices, maybe we look at increases in inflation. But then there's also, all these various second order effects that happen when parts of the policy are not necessarily grounded in empirical evidence. It has been the dilemma of other developing countries as well, and it has been our dilemma as well, which I'm very pleased to report that things are slowly changing, as evidenced by, the policies taken within this budget, that we're now slowly and gradually gravitating towards making policies that are more like based in empirical evidence. They're looking into the impact, the actual economic impact, or like the economic impact of these policies on the welfare of the citizen. I think that is supremely important. But I mean, and I can come to this point later, but I think equally important is the fact that we collect data, on all these different indicators. Like we collect data on women's labor force participation, on women's educational attainment, on the overall well-being of mothers. This is where the tax on contraceptives actually comes in, because there's
Mhm.
research, in the US that women's investment in their own employment was raised by nearly 10% due to contraceptives being more accessible to them. And so I think it is this kind of evidence that is so important for us, for developing countries like ours, that is looking for economic growth, to be able to assess what impact the policies are making. And not only that, because, there's one way to look at it. We can say, now that we've made a policy, what impact did it have? But then there's this other way where we look at the data, we see what the data is telling us, and then we make our policies around that fact. But for that, we need to have, actual investment into data collection as well. Because for all of these indicators, for for labor, for wages, for education, for health, we need really good, sound foundation of data to be able to, make these policies that then affect these indicators, not just on the paper, but in fact affect people's lives. Yeah.
So this is exactly what I wanted to come to, because something that really personally interests me is how the budget is made, right? And what does it rely on? And the first step, I would assume, as you've just mentioned, is collection of data, right? It's the analysis, it's the understanding of what the ground realities are, that the budget needs to respond to, and that fiscal decision making needs to really respond to. Could you give me a better idea of how reliable the data is in Pakistan because, I've been working in different areas. And one of the biggest problems we have is data collection, right? We don't have the protocols, we don't have the standards. We have varying different, one department does it in a different way, another does it in a different way. And then provincial variations. So at the federal level, how can we rely on this data, and what do you feel, when it comes to the economy, health, education, and labor, in all of these areas, can we take sound decisions based on what we're getting?
So this is a topic that's very close to my heart. I recently also posted on X like a very long thread on
Absolutely.
specifically because I'll be perfectly honest with you, the main data sets that we work with, are data sets for GDP, the labor force survey, the household economic survey. These are some of the main data sets on which almost all of our policies are based, right? So predominantly all of the human capital related policies are based. And now when I went into like the budget books for the Pakistan's Bureau of Statistics, I just wanted to, this is in fact what I wanted to see, like how much are we spending on data collection? Because like I mentioned before, I think sound data collection forms the foundation of the best policies. Because if our data is not accurate, if it does not reflect actually what's happening in the economy, I doubt we can be able to, come up with policies that address those issues. So I I'm afraid to say I don't really have really great news when it comes to the type of data that we're collecting. I mean, I have my reservations with it. So because like I said, policy is as good as the number underlying that policy. But as far as for example, even if we talk about GDP now, Federal Board of Revenue's annual targets are basically indexed to GDP. That's what we call autonomous growth. And it predominantly depends on what the GDP number and what the inflation number is going to be like.
Yeah.
And both our inflation numbers and GDP numbers, again, are, based off of surveys that are done by the Pakistan Bureau of Statistics. And I do want to mention here that Pakistan Bureau of Statistics' entire year's budget is just 5 billion rupees. I honestly think that for an organization where like people are going out almost every week to collect inflation data, I just don't think that budget is enough. Like if anybody goes into the books of the organization, they'd be able to see that, that's a place where the government needs to probably prioritize a lot of, spending and a lot of investment, in fact. Because what I've observed is that, for example, for the GDP, for instance, you may remember that the GDP was rebased in 2022 and rebased to 2015, 2016 numbers. And that caused like this large jump in what the GDP figure is. Now, what this means is I'm not saying that rebasing should not be done. What I'm trying to highlight here is the fact that due to that one exercise where we rebase the numbers, and essentially what we were saying was that previously we were calculating or basing our GDP calculations on numbers that were kind of old and did not really reflect the economy. But now that we're rebasing it, we're kind of actually trying to reflect what the economy is actually creating. And that caused a huge jump in GDP. Now, what needs to really be emphasized here is that jump in GDP was not because of any new production that happened. It was just because of the mechanics of the calculation that go into the rebasing of the national accounts, right? And so that kind of highlights how important it is to have accurate data. And now whatever GDP number we measure, we kind of index our target to that, our annual revenue target to that. And what that means is that what we're saying is essentially that this is the amount of GDP that we expect to gain in 2027. And therefore, this part of it should come in as revenue. But how are we measuring that in reality, right? So like, for example, if we did talk about agriculture, for the federal capital, like livestock is part of the agriculture income tax that is supposed to be collected by the federal capital, basically by the FBR. But if you go into the survey data and you look at how those numbers have been created, so for example, if you're saying that livestock, and I have the numbers right here, I think livestock, like the 14.6% of the GDP is coming from livestock. So livestock alone, yes, the livestock alone contributes 14.6% to our annual GDP, right? And so, but when you go into the numbers, you see that how do we get to that figure? How do we get to the amount of actual livestock? Like how the exact figure, that's based off of a survey that was done 20 years ago, like in 2006. The last livestock survey was done in 2006. And since then, we've essentially been extrapolating that data to now today say that, yes, livestock contributes 14.6% to the GDP. But I mean, for PBS, an institution whose mandate it is to collect that data, if it has been so hard to be able to get at the actual number, I mean, I doubt that it is easier to be able to generate revenue from that, in the quantum as the contribution to the GDP. And that is just one example, right? And so while I'm not saying that, those numbers, what I'm trying to say from this conversation is that we need to invest a lot more in how we collect our data, right?
Yeah.
Similarly, for our household economic survey, the HIES that the PBS does, that has also, I think this one has been published after a gap of 6 years. So the last one we had was in 2019, and now we have the next one. Same is the case with poverty. So the point here is that, we're making policies every year, we're making the budget every year, but we're basing it off of numbers that isn't really measuring on a year-to-year basis what's happening in the economy, right? And so I think that's an area where substantial improvement and investment needs to happen before we can expect, real policies to create real change.
Wow, no, it's fascinating because I mean this is stuff that we are just blind to, especially as a layman, so thank you so much for that. Zahra, I think, one other aspect is that sitting sometimes in Islamabad or wherever we are, we're isolated. We don't really understand how large a country Pakistan is. Pakistan is a massive country. And, some people might say 5 billion is a great number, but 5 billion is $17 million roughly, right? Which is nothing for a nation of our size. And so I think collecting data, I'm 100% with you. And I've done some work on human rights related data collection. And because, Pakistan is under an obligation for the EU GSP Plus mechanism, we do a lot of data collection under that. But even there, right, there are deficiencies and there are mechanisms where, even though they've created quite a robust system, it's still, nowhere near where you want to get the type of data on human rights and compliance and labor related issues. So yeah, I think one is the scale, and secondly is our capacity and our ability to really deal with those things.
I completely understand. And I think, again, like, I think we can gain fundamental economic results by having just the right data or like access to data. Because like, if I look at developed countries, they collect data about literally everything. And I mean,
Yeah.
obviously, there's a reason behind that, right? Because data is power. In today's world, especially with AI and everything, data is the actual commodity that's going to take any country places, if it wants to. So yeah, I completely agree with you.
Absolutely, absolutely. No, let's hope we can get a major focus on it. But I have a lot of hope because one, digitization really solves a lot of the data related issues, and I think Pakistan is making strides in that department. And the other is the issue of analysis, right? We've That's also something that needs. And with AI, I think you can make strides and you can make there. Of course, that's never going to replace. Brilliant economists like yourself, but it still, it helps ease the process as well. Zahra, I wanted to talk about, something which has been boggling my mind, but it's also, I'm sure, our viewers' mind and that is, non-filers and bringing them into the tax net. And we hear about this every single year, right? Is this mainly an issue of enforcement? And I say this having an absolute right to say this, being a salaried taxpayer. I feel like the entire burden is on my shoulders running this country. But is this an issue of enforcement? Is it an issue of data? Is it an issue of a lack in public trust? People don't trust the government, and so they don't want to give the money to the government. Um, are these issues, or is it just something like a part of our culture where we don't pay tax, and that's just how Pakistanis are?
No, I think that's a very interesting question. I think it's a question that has, to me, as a professional and an academic interested in taxes, it has always and always attracted me. And one thing I will say is that it's kind of like a combination of all of these things that you've mentioned. It is a combination of enforcement. It is definitely one of the reasons is trust. One of the reasons, of course, is culture, right? So every country has a specific fiscal economic landscape. Fortunately or unfortunately, ours is an economic landscape shaped by the political economy of it, maybe, shaped predominantly by
Mm.
the political economy of it, where people generally do not want to pay taxes. Well, I mean, of course, people don't want to pay taxes anywhere in the world. I mean, that is for sure. But I mean, in Pakistan in particular, I think I've always kind of framed it as a twin problem. I framed it as a problem of evasion and a problem of trust. But before I come to that, I think from the point of view of non-filers, because it is a subject matter, like it's a topic that interests a lot of people, both technically who are interested in this subject, but also people who are not technically interested in this subject, but just because they're themselves taxpayers, like you just mentioned, would be very interested in knowing like this phenomena, right? So when we talk about non-filers, when we talk about broadening of the tax base, it's very interesting because people sometimes conflate the two things. We're talking about bringing more taxpayers into the tax net.
Yeah.
And this could appear in two forms, right? We could just simply add more taxpayers into the tax net, into the tax administration, but maybe those taxpayers bring in no income that's not already part of the tax net. But then we bring in taxpayers who actually also bring in income that was previously not part of the tax net. So I'll explain this with an example because I think this is very important, just for general understanding. So for example, let's assume we have, let's say, I don't know, 50 million salaried individuals in the country. Maybe it's less, maybe it's more. I don't really have an exact figure. But let's say we have 50 million individuals who are just salary income earners, right? They don't have any other source of income.
Yeah.
Now, let's assume that in our tax net, we have just 2 million of those people. Now, we can say that, the rest of the 48 million are non-filers. But what is the system really getting by incorporating them into the tax net? Because their taxes are already coming to the government, right? Because they're withheld at source and they're deposited to the government. Now, if those 48 million individuals become part of the tax net, of course, we would technically be broadening the tax net. But we're not necessarily getting any other revenue, right? Because their revenue, does whether or not they file the tax return, is already coming to the government. But what it does add is more administrative burden, because of course we do have, as a developing country, and a relatively smaller developing country, we do have a lack of resources, because like looking at 50 million returns or so is a cumbersome process, right? Because then it becomes enforcement and administration becomes a huge deal. But there's a flip side to that, and that's another argument that I always make, is that when we talk about broadening of the tax net, especially for an economic landscape like ours, I think what we need to focus on, and that has been proven in the literature as well, the literature on tax enforcement and compliance, that we need to focus on the pockets of information and economic activity that are really going to generate revenue for the government. Because like I mentioned with this example, like if we're running after taxpayers whose tax is already coming to the government, it's not going to yield any benefits, right? So if we go after people who are not already part of the net, that's where the benefit is going to come from. Now, coming to the point, like, why is there non-filing specifically in those segments where there's significant economic activity? And this is where it becomes like this twin problem, right? So it becomes a twin problem because these people who are essentially, we call them non-compliant because, they're not fulfilling their obligation to file their tax returns. But why are they doing that? Is because prior to this year, the cost of non-complying with tax laws was relatively low, right? So for example, if you haven't filed a tax return, you can pay 1,000 rupees and become a filer anytime during the year. But this year that has changed because we've increased penalties for non-compliance by a substantial amount, right? So because the underlying intent with that was that evasion happens, and again, literature supports that, a lot of research supports that. Evasion happens because people generally think that the cost of evasion, like what will I lose in monetary terms if I'm evading, is almost negligible, right? And so that kind of helps me continue to evade taxes. Now, for example, if I'm not a filer and I have to pay 25,000 rupees to become a filer, that will definitely have an impact on my decision to file or not. Right. So I do think that that's one thing. So I think this year's budget kind of addresses that problem at its root, like where we are now making it more costly and expensive to be non-compliant with the system. And so essentially what we're doing is we're building a system that is not easy to cheat and that is not easy to escape. I mean, at least these are steps in that direction. But then there's this other problem with the trust. And the happy news is that this year's budget also tackles that part of the problem. And what happens there is that with trust, people generally, across the years have had this experience, which again is unfortunate. Many people have had, experiences where they feel like they've been, not handled well by the tax department. They've faced or suffered some unnecessary communication with the tax department where they felt like they were pressured, into various conversations that they didn't want to have and stuff like that. And the signal that gives to other people is that, don't file your taxes, because once you're in the system, you're going to face, all these different unnecessary challenges with the tax administration. And so the better way is just to remain outside the system. And one of the reasons that people sometimes suffer these issues is because, officers may end up using some of their discretion to not essentially to the advantage of the taxpayer, which is unfortunate whenever that happens. But then this year's budget has taken that into account, has taken that behavior into account, and has essentially, introduced this auto tax office with a faceless system, where the taxpayer and the tax officer interact. They do have this communication, but that communication does not allow the tax officer to use their discretion to the disadvantage of the taxpayer. So what's going to happen is that all the discretionary functions of one taxpayer, previously they rested with one individual officer, and therefore they had a lot of control over what happens with that case. With the new system now in place and kind of rolling in the process of rolling out, one single taxpayer, first of all, the taxpayer won't know the officer that they're dealing with. And similarly, the officer won't know the taxpayer that they're dealing with. And so they'll only see the case file. They'll only see the material information, like what is the issue being discussed? Is there an issue? And then they'll conduct the transaction. And I think that takes out a majority of the issue due to which trust issues arise with the tax administration.
So
And I
abuse
think
of power and issues like that would be, wow, okay, that's really interesting. Yeah.
With the use of this system, I mean, I think that these kinds of issues would appear, less frequently, because of and in an ideal world, of course, they should entirely disappear because of the fact that there's no face-to-face interaction between the taxpayer and the officer. Because there's this study by the IMF, and again, I can share the link, if that's required.
Yes,
but that study essentially that study essentially said that due to taxpayer and officer collusion, there is a loss of revenue to approximately 10% per case.
Wow.
So, I mean, that's substantial, and especially again for a country like ours, that is substantial. And, the other disadvantage that this lack of trust has is that when they stop trusting the tax administration, it stops also becoming a deterrent. Right? Because they know that they're getting the system in one way or the other. And so by fixing this issue with trust and, bringing in the faceless system, bringing in an auto tax office, taking away the discretionary powers in a way that they don't harm the taxpayer in the long run, I think will also benefit in that way by creating more deterrents for, the tax administration, which is one of the key things if we want to ensure that people comply with the tax system.
Absolutely. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. Zed, do you also feel that informality in the informal sector, because it's so big in Pakistan, right? That we prefer cash transactions and we prefer staying outside of that. Do you think that is part of why we do this? Because in research I was doing in Quetta, right, on why Hawala Hundi is used so much, and they say that this is not. It's not because we want to break the law or anything. This is just part of our tradition and custom, right? This is how we used to, transfer funds to when we used to trade in Iran, even before independence. And so, informality, I think, is kind of built in also to an extent in cultural activity or the way economic activity has worked in Pakistan. So do you feel that is, a reason for why a lot of people try to stay outside of the tax net?
I definitely think that's a reason, because especially on the sales tax side where you have supply chains and where, you're taking products from one person and selling them to another person. And then, it kind of becomes like this input output chain where you have your suppliers and then the manufacturers and the distributors. So speaking specifically about sales tax, I do think that's definitely an issue, because then what happens is that sometimes people who are part of the net need to charge a certain price because they are also accounting for the taxes that they pay. Whereas, like maybe a shop 2 stores down to them may not be maybe outside of the net, and therefore they're able to charge a price that is relatively lower, right? Because they're not paying their taxes, and so they can charge a lower price and therefore be maybe more attractive to customers, like 100% more attractive to customers, because I as an individual would definitely buy from somebody with a lower price. So those elements of the way our economy is structured definitely play a role. But again, I do think that one of the good news in that, like from that perspective in this year's budget, is how we're incorporating third-party data. Because again, there's a lot of research that shows that, regarding economic transactions, if we're having, data on transactions being reported by a third party, in addition to the taxpayer themselves, the rate of evasion goes down by nearly 40%. So,
Wow.
for example, if I have a taxpayer who knows that, there's no third-party reporting of his transactions, their evasion compared to a taxpayer who knows that whatever they transact, or like a majority of what the transactions that they're doing are also being reported by a third party. So, for example, by a bank, let's say, or by a withholding agent, they are 40% less likely to evade their taxes. And so with this year's budget, I think we've some of these provisions were also part of previous budgets. Like the ball started to roll, like I think in the previous budget regarding this. But within this year's budget, there are several provisions that now allow us to incorporate third-party data into our CRM, which is the compliance risk management system, which is based off of artificial intelligence and machine learning, and which is kind of the intent is to build like a 360 degrees profile of a taxpayer. So essentially looking at all of their essentially their declaration, that the return, which is the return that they have filed themselves, and then data from third-party sources, so from banks, from NADRA, and from their own like other withholding agents, that the data we have coming in, stuff like that, just to see, and also import data sometimes for manufacturers and such, just to see that whether their declaration matches with other economic transactions that they're conducting. And the more the system rolls out, the more integrations we have with third-party sources. And this includes also some authorities within the provinces. So, for example, land registration authorities or vehicle registration authorities, and, banks is like national. The more integrations we have with these various authorities that record these transactions, the more we'll be able to better identify whether there are patterns of evasion, and therefore the more difficult it will be for taxpayers to then kind of keep staying out of the net, because the cost is going to be higher in terms of the fact that if we find them evading, they'll not only will they have to pay the penalty, but they'll also have to then compensate and pay for the taxes. So the attraction for staying outside of the net, it just becomes less attractive, to be honest. That's at least the hope.
Yeah.
That's the hope.
Zehra, what I found really interesting is, I feel like the state itself has started taking tax more seriously, because there used to be a point where, this person, they don't pay tax, this and that, and it's so now there's an active effort. And I mean, one sign is the Anti-Money Laundering Act, for example, didn't have tax evasion or as a predicate offense. So money laundering couldn't be done with money that you had taken out of but now it is, right? The last few years we've included this. So I really feel that there is a seriousness that has come into the way the government has done it. And I think this is a response to much of the criticism that, people from the salaried class were saying that, you're just targeting us because we're easy targets. And the business sector doesn't do it, and anytime any major taxes they try to impose it or something, there's a big hartal or a strike that takes place, and you don't get anywhere. Do you feel that that is also part of the issue as well?
Yes, absolutely. Because I think, again, like, the complaint with the salaried individuals and any person who's earning income on which taxes are being withheld at source, they have basically no way essentially to escape taxation, right? And the reason behind that, because of the visibility of information. And this is exactly what, these new systems and these new interventions are doing, is creating visibility on these transactions.
Okay,
And
wow.
of course, like a lot of these initiatives, faced a lot of backlash. When you're talking about the budget making process, and that involves like sitting down with all these stakeholders, and that means sitting down with tax bar associations, with taxpayers, with various authorized representatives of different sectors, then sitting down also with, stakeholders within the government, within the provincial governments, within the Senate, within, the cabinet, and just coalition partners and such, just to sit down on one table and to understand that this is what we need to do and we need to accomplish. And some of these interventions, like you must have seen in the news, that when we're talking about integrating with banks, there was a lot of backlash because people were reluctant, for their information to be coming to the FBR.
Yeah, yeah.
But I think you're absolutely right in saying that there's a lot of like, we have, protests by trade bodies and such. And then people continue to say that, you're not taxing the traders, you're not taxing the retailers. But, whenever we try and do that, there's a lot of protests and everything. But I think one of the fundamental things, especially in terms of equity, tax equity, is to be able to create an environment or a tax system where it is difficult for people to stay outside of the net so that these concentrated actions are not required. We still have some concentrated actions, and in that way I think majority of the burden of the tax system is being borne by people who are visible to the state rather than people who are outside of the net and conveniently remain to do so. But I think the government, the senior leadership, I think there is actual will that they've shown that they want to bring everybody into the tax net, even if it is small steps in those directions. In certain cases, those steps are definitely there.
Mm.
Because I mean, and again, I would like to highlight also the fact that we're looking at broadening of the tax base, but then there's also a lot of evasion within the documented sector, right? And so,
Of course, yeah.
with these reforms, these interventions, we're trying to tackle both of these dimensions. We're trying to bring in, people who are not in the net. We're trying to bring in incomes that are not already in the net, but then at the same time, we're also making it hard for people who are inside the net to not declare completely what they're earning and the amount of tax that they then owe to the state.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. Um, I think I, as a salaried or the salaried class, will also, going to protest, but we have to be at the office. So, um, there is, we don't have much of a
Yes.
the time there. But no, I think it makes a lot of sense. This, it gives a lot of hope there. We've seen, one thing that was touted quite a bit with this budget is that it's giving relief to the salaried class, and it's giving relief. In terms of property and withholding related to that. Now, Pakistan may, far better than I do that, the property sector is a key area where we, funnel in a lot of money. That's become, the safety net for a lot of families across the country. Um, do you think that this is like a recognition, one on um, that this is a sector that we can't get away from, that this is something that Pakistanis have some sort of sentimental or some sort of attachment to, and secondly, do you feel that this is a recognition that the salaried class has paid way too much in taxes or is disproportionately affected by this thing, and it's a recognition of that, and do you feel that this is going to have an impact on, say, how the economy is going to start growing again?
Yes. Again, I think that's the debate on the salaried class. I think that's now kind of become like there was a point I think where it kind of became like a national debate with the
Yeah,
salaried
yeah.
individuals. I am also, by the way, a salaried
I know,
individual.
I know, I know. It's two salaried individuals just talking about this. Absolutely.
Absolutely. No, I definitely think that the government's basically this initiative of giving relief to the salaried class was 100% a recognition of the fact that taxes on the salaried class should be lower. I do think that there's also broad understanding and broad recognition of the fact that taxes across the board should be ideally lower than they are right now. We're trying to bring them, like, we've made changes to the super tax also in recognition of the same thing. We've lowered tax rates on the salary class also in recognition of the same thing. So I definitely think that from the leadership's point of view, I think this is definitely there, and of course a lot of advocacy for that has happened as well, which I think is always helpful because sometimes I feel like policymakers are thinking from a different perspective, and then the public, of course, is coming in from a different perspective. And I think it's when both these perspectives come face to face is when we try to correct the direction of the policy. So I do think that this is comes from the recognition that rates could be lower. But when it comes to property and real estate, also there is this recognition that the real estate sector in its entirety, it's not just one sector, right? So you have various industries within this sector. We have the cement industry, we have the steel industry, we also have labor. There's a lot of employment that's generated. There's
Absolutely.
also a lot of other things that happen when construction activity increases within a certain country, right? And so I think broadly, to attract investment into the country, broadly to make it easy for people to invest in land, to be able to kind of generate incomes and livelihood and employment through the activity of construction and real estate, I think has been one of the drivers, because historically we've seen that a lot of economic activity is related to or like jointly working alongside the real estate sector. So I think that's one of the motivations for kind of reducing taxes on the real estate. And in general, I think the government is moving, in this direction. I think it's the general understanding that all sort of transactional taxes, such as the transactional taxes on property, 236C and K, the advanced taxes that we take, at the time of transaction of property, maybe need to go away. So that is the broader understanding, because, it's almost nowhere else in the world where transaction taxes are present, in the way and form that they're present here in Pakistan. So I think one of the key things, in the budget making process that has evolved and changed positively over the years is like this, intention to correct the tax policy wherever it isn't really aligned with people's interests and it isn't really aligned with the principles of tax equity. And so I think that's definitely a step in the right direction from the point of view of the leadership.
Sarah, thank you so much. On that positive note, I think we'll end. This has been really informative, and it's certainly for me personally, it's really opened my eyes up to a lot of elements of how the tax, how the budget is developed. So I'm really grateful to you, Sarah, for that.
No, absolutely. Thank you so much. I mean, I honestly, I enjoy talking about this. It is my professional subject and my academic subject, as I've mentioned before.
Wonderful.
And I think there's such a lot of information that can be gained from having these discussions. And I do think that it could have some public benefit as well, these conversations. So I was very happy to have this conversation with you. And I would like to thank you very much again for having me on your
No,
podcast.
you're very welcome again. And I really, really enjoy your tweets because they're these bite-sized. They give you a glimpse into whether it's budget making or whether it's the economic side of things in Pakistan. But it's something we're not exposed to, and I think being able to communicate that in a way to the general public is a phenomenal gift. And so I'm really grateful to you for that as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
I try my best. I try my best, and I hopefully will continue to do that. I
Absolutely.
appreciate.
Ladies and gentlemen, that's all we have for today. I'm grateful to our guest. If you're watching this on television, this is a shortened version of our show. To get the full version, please go to Dawn News English's YouTube channel. Thank you very much.